Hi guys, so before launching into this, I want to go ahead and say that this video actually is sponsored for realsies this time by, once again, Gallo Glass Books. Now, they are doing a special pre-order sale right now for the book Giordano, Bruno, and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis A. Yates. So I don't have a physical copy of that, unfortunately, because it is still in pre-order, but it's $5 off if you go to their website. Links, of course, will be in the description and whatnot. I have read a little bit of the text in question here, and it's very interesting. It takes a very kind of mystical but very scholarly approach to Bruno's work in contextualizing Bruno's thought within Hermeticism and Kabbalah and esoteric Christianity and things like that. And in this video, we're going to be looking at Bruno kind of more within the context of the evolution of Western ontology and metaphysics. So thank you once again to Gallo Glass Books, of course. Links are in the description, and to the video. Good morning, afternoon, or whatever, ladies and gentlemen. How you doing? So if you're looking for the third installment of my series of videos, which is allegedly about Jean Gebser's text, The Ever-Present Origin, fear not, for that is on the way and should be done within a week or so. But today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be taking a slight kind of sort of detour and talking about the Renaissance Hermeticist Giordano Bruno. Now, I say slight kind of sort of detour because the story of Giordano Bruno, and particularly the way that he developed a cosmology in contrast to medieval Christian Aristotelianism, is actually a story that fits in very nicely with the story that I've been telling thus far within that Ever-Present Origin series. So we are going to be coming back to Bruno's ideas within that context, but today we're going to be looking at Bruno's work specifically because there's a lot to talk about here, and this is a great way not only to illustrate the medieval Aristotelian cosmology and the way that Bruno would begin to diverge from it, but also the way in which divergences from medieval Aristotelianism would result in the development of some very specific and some very crucial new ideas that would come into play during the Renaissance, which would lay the groundwork for modernity. So we're going to start off here by talking about some context. Now, within the Renaissance period, there was already a very growing movement of Hermeticism, which was already in a very tense, if not adversarial relationship with the doctrines of the Catholic Church. The Hermeticists believed that they were kind of archaeologists of esotericism. They believed that they were investigating a perennial cosmological and metaphysical tradition which had its origins in ancient Egypt, and that this cosmology, this metaphysics, was then sent through the Greeks, through Plato and Aristotle, and eventually would make its way into Christianity. These guys put a lot of emphasis on ancient history. They believed that the more ancient wisdom was that which was more authentic and more true. One of the most important figures in this whole narrative was, of course, Hermes Trismegistus, as the name Hermeticism implies, and it was generally presumed that Hermes Trismegistus was an actual historical figure, and in fact there was a lot of debate during this time as to when exactly Hermes Trismegistus might have lived, because it was believed that he lived either before or shortly after or even contemporaneous with Moses. And so there's this connection that's being made there between the biblical tradition and the Hermetic tradition that was very important to these Hermeticists. They were certainly Christians in a very general sense, but these were Christians who saw Christianity within the context of this kind of perennial wisdom project and didn't necessarily see the wisdom of Christianity as something that was simply bestowed by the church, let's say. Giordano Bruno was born in 1548, and as a child he would be sent to an Augustinian monastery in Naples to begin his education. At 17, he would then join the Dominican order, where he would continue his studies, and as a young man in his early 20s, he became known for his very preternatural memory capabilities. And in fact, at a certain point, he was actually sent to Pope Pius V to demonstrate these extraordinary memory capabilities. And in his 20s, Giordano Bruno was already getting himself into trouble. He was accused of recommending controversial books to a student, he was accused of defending the Arian heresy, and he was accused of having a copy of Erasmus's works which were banned. And eventually this would really just culminate in Bruno having a vehemently anti-Aristotelian stance, which would put him in a very awkward position with regards to the Catholic Church, needless to say. Giordano Bruno was, much like myself, a person of a terminally rebellious disposition, but really, Giordano Bruno himself didn't see it that way. He saw himself as an adherent of this perennial wisdom tradition that had been there all along. In a sense, he saw himself as more pious than his Aristotelian adversaries. But despite this, there's still a sense in which Bruno's cosmology would be radically novel, not just in relation to the church Aristotelianism, but in relation to the Neoplatonic tradition as a whole, and that novelty is, I believe, what is most significant here. So then, why exactly did Bruno take such issue with Catholic Aristotelianism? Now, he himself would have said that the Catholic Aristotelians were simply out of step with this perennial hermetic wisdom, but I think there's something deeper going on here, and in order to understand that, I want us to actually first look at the Nominalist movement, which occurred before Bruno during the 13th century. So the Nominalists were a group of medieval scholastic Christian philosophers who also kind of set themselves up in opposition to Aristotelianism. So first, what we need to do here is take a look at Aristotelianism, and particularly the Christian interpretation of Aristotelianism. Now, the way that we are taught this within a kind of philosophy 101 sort of setting goes something like this. We're told that Plato believed that the forms existed in this completely independent reality, this Platonic heaven, which was completely disconnected from nature, that the forms simply exist in themselves as these pristine, unmoving, eternal objects, and they're just kind of there, in a sense. Then we're told that Aristotle kind of differentiates himself from Plato, and that Aristotle tells us that forms only are real insofar as they are instantiated in matter. So this way of explaining all this is a problem for a number of reasons. It glosses over a whole bunch of things, but the primary thing with regards to Aristotle that's being glossed over here is that Aristotle doesn't say that forms only exist in matter. Aristotle says that forms only exist in substance, and there is a distinction here. Substance and matter are not the same for Aristotle. For Aristotle, matter is what Plato calls the chora. It is the receptacle. It is the groundless ground, as Eckhart would describe it. It is this kind of formless darkness within which reality, within which nature can come to be generated. It is understood to be this kind of inert, pure potentiality, as it were. And then you have that potentiality of formlessness contrasted with the actuality of form. So materiality then is understood to be a kind of corporeal substance. It is a means by which the form of psyche is able to conjugate with the formlessness of the prima materia, such that you have this interpenetration of potentiality and actuality. But then you have psychical substance, and it is possible within the Aristotelian framework to have beings that are composed entirely of psychical substance. This is how the Aristotelians viewed the celestial spheres and angels. They believed that for beings composed entirely of psychical substance, there was no distance, as it were, between potentiality and actuality. So here we need to keep in mind that the forms are also, in a sense, ideals. So if we look at the human organism, for example, we could say that the human psyche consists of an entirely idealized version of the human being, but because of this embodiment within the prima materia, this darkness or formlessness or indeterminacy that is inherent within matter, there's always this kind of gap, as it were, between the ideal and the real. We are never perfect mirror images of the ideal that is represented by the world of psyche. But for entities that are consisting entirely of psychical substance, such as the celestial spheres or angels or what have you, there is no such distance because there is no intermixing with the cora, with the prima materia, with that darkness. That isn't present anymore. It's just psychical substance, and therefore these beings essentially are their own ideals in a sense. There's no gap between potentiality and actuality. They are pure actuality. So substance for Aristotle is not matter. Materiality is a kind of substantiality, but substance in itself is rather ousia. And ousia is understood to be the particularity of an immanent thing. It is the conjugation of whatever forms and potentially matter might come together to form the identity of something. So an Aristotelian could say that an angel, for example, even though immaterial, is nonetheless substantial insofar as its substance consists in a particular conjugation of psyche, a particular coalescence of forms that make it real. So in other words, the realness of something is the particular coalescence, the particular concrescence, we could say, of forms into something that can then exist, can persist as an independent being. Now, what's most significant here is the way in which this Aristotelian doctrine of ousia is going to have implications for identity and for freedom. And to illustrate this, I want to take kind of a weird example, an example from the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, which was published during the late 15th century. Now, there's a very interesting part of this text which really illustrates what the implications of ousia actually are. It's a discussion about the purported ability for witches to transform into animals. And the text tells us that this isn't actually possible, that when witches seem to be transforming into foxes or goats or what have you, that this is simply an illusion created by the devil. And the argument that's put forward here for why this is not actually possible, why it is not actually possible for a human being to actually physically transform into an animal, is very illustrative of what the broader implications of ousia actually are. So the text tells us that this transmorgification must be illusory because of the way in which the identity, the ousia of a living being, is necessarily a particular conjugation of psyche and corporeality. So a horse, for example, is a horse insofar as its psyche consists of the forms which together constitute horseness. That's what makes the horse what it is. The psyche consists of the forms which then inform matter. So, in other words, if I were to transform into a horse, that would necessarily imply that my human psyche was substituted for horse psyche, and if that were to occur, then I would essentially just cease to exist. My substantiality, my being, is a particular coalescence of psyche and corporeality, and if you change that, then you don't have the same ousia anymore. You don't have the same substantiality. I would essentially cease to exist if I were to actually do something like that. So now I want us to think about what exactly this doctrine of ousia then implies about human freedom. With regards to the transmorgification of witches, what's being stated here is that there's no extra thing and no immaterial soul, as it were, which exists independently of psyche and corporeality, which those things adhere within. The human soul is rather just a particular constellation of those things. There's nothing else, as it were, behind that, in such a way that the psyche and corporeality can be changed while leaving a particular identity intact. Now, this might all seem rather counterintuitive, right? When we think of medieval Christianity, we tend to think that these people certainly believed in an immaterial soul, but what we need to keep in mind here is that within this context, what is meant by the immateriality of the human soul is simply the possibility of the dematerialization of the human psychical substance. So, in other words, it's possible for a human being to exist as kind of like how an angel would, as pure psychical substance where there is no longer any kind of distance between potentiality and actuality. So, in other words, we would be fully idealized. However, if you stripped away the psyche from the human being, there would be nothing left over. There's no other thing which lacks properties, which lacks forms, which then serves as kind of a medium which the psyche and the corporeality adhere within. So before returning to the nominalists and then Giordano Bruno, I want us to take a little bit of a tangent here. I want us to look at what this metaphysics actually implies about the Christian notion of salvation. And in particular, what I want us to look at here is salvation in terms of the kingdom of heaven, the way in which the earth is said to eventually come to a point where it has been fully redeemed, fully elevated, so as to become the new Jerusalem, the body of Christ and such. So, as we've already begun to see, this Aristotelian Christian conception is one within which the fallenness of the bodily realm is its materiality. The fallenness of the living human organism is its participation in the pure potentiality of the chora, of the receptacle, the prima materia, this underlying darkness which ensures a distance between the ideal and the real, between potentiality and actuality. And so when we look up to the angels and the heavens, the celestial spheres, we see pure psyche, pure psychical substance without any such darkness. Psyche which has been completely divorced, in other words, from the Great Mother, as Plato referred to her. So really think about this for a moment. What would this salvation of the earth actually imply? What would it mean for the earth to become the new heaven on earth, the kingdom of heaven? Well, what it seems to imply is a complete dematerialization of the earth, as though the psychical realm of pure idyllicness were to contract into the earth, as it were, and thereby purify it, rid it of its materiality, purify its darkness, its indeterminacy, its mere apparentness, such that there is nothing left but the ideal, the determinate. Now, what's interesting here is that we can see a direct continuity between what's going on here within this Aristotelian Christian notion of ultimate idealness and salvation and what we see in techno-scientific capitalism and physicalism. Remember how Heidegger tells us the way in which the process of enframing kind of strips away the being from the world. It is essentially a kind of dematerialization of living reality. There is a kind of darkness within the very aliveness of the living world. There's always indeterminacy, unpredictability. There's always the hiddenness of that which is in the world, and this project of enframing, this kind of techno-capitalistic way of engaging with the world, you have this will to dematerialize the world, to strip away all of that darkness, as it were, such that the only thing left is the mechanized. The only thing left is that which is a representation of ideals, of mental objects, which human beings have come up with. It is a way of grasping onto the world in order to render it less threatening, in a sense, to make it into something that we have complete control over, by making it into something that is fully present, as it were, for the scrutiny of the human ego. So even though on the face of it, it might seem that medieval Christian Aristotelianism and techno-scientific capitalism are diametrically opposed to one another, there is nonetheless a common thread that unites both, and that common thread is, in a sense, the disavowal of the bodily. The medieval Aristotelians saw themselves as having taken the high ground on this issue. Roman Christianity itself kind of defined itself in contrast to Gnosticism, which it saw as vehemently anti-bodily. The Gnostics were seen as oriented towards this kind of transcendence which completely disavowed the bodily world. But we can see here that even within medieval Aristotelian Christianity, this kind of ambivalence towards corporeality is still there. It's just less obvious than it was within Gnosticism. In many ways, Christianity at its very core is a promise of redemption through reconciliation of the earthly and heavenly realms, reconciliation of the bodily and the psychical. And yet we can see here within this Aristotelian doctrine that even in medieval Christianity, this reconciliation is still incomplete. One of the primary ways in which it remains incomplete, I would argue, is in terms of human freedom. And so we've already begun to see the way in which this Aristotelian form of Christianity puts human freedom in this kind of weird spot. We are just kind of compelled by whatever our psychical substance happens to be, because there's nothing behind that which can steer the ship independently of psyche, as it were. So this, I believe, is going to be the primary motivator for the nominalists and for Giordano Bruno. So here we should begin by talking about what the nominalists are actually arguing for. So what they're saying is that there is no psychical substance, really. There are no forms which kind of dictate us from the heavenly realm. Rather, the forms are just ideas. They're just categories or generalizations, names, which our minds concoct, as it were, in order to make sense of the world around us. The ideas, then, that we see in the world are ideas within the mind of God, but there is no psychical substance which dictates our behaviors. Now, the nominalists themselves are not necessarily going to put it this way. They're not necessarily going to frame this issue in terms of human freedom, but rather in terms of the freedom of God. The argument they're going to make is essentially that within the Aristotelian cosmos, God is limited by the forms. Now, I don't really think that this line of reasoning is entirely forthcoming. I don't think that this is the actual underlying motivation for the nominalists. As I've already stated, I think this has much more to do with human freedom. And part of the reason for that is simply that the argument that is being made here in terms of the freedom of God is very easy to counter from the Aristotelian perspective. So within the Aristotelian cosmology, God is the unmoved mover. It is kind of like the ultimate ideal, the meta-ideal, the meta-form, as it were, the form of formedness. And therefore, it is the most basic kind of actuality that pre-exists everything. And it's also the condition for the possibility of all the other forms, because all the other forms kind of unfold out of that central cosmic unmoved mover, that's proteusia, as Aristotle would call it. So to say that the forms limit God in some sense is not a very compelling argument, I don't think, if you're looking at this from the Aristotelian perspective, because really it's the unity and necessity of God that is primary, and then the necessity that we see within all the other forms is derivative from the necessity of God. But if we look at this issue in terms of human freedom, then this whole nominalist thing starts to make a lot more sense. By rendering the world of psyche as a world of mere ideas, mere categories or generalizations which are created by minds, then suddenly there is no world of psychical necessity which is imposing itself upon the human being. There's now this kind of unmediated relationship between the freedom of the human being and the freedom of God. So the nominalist movement in itself is then going to set the stage for scientific empiricism, a worldview within which we don't encounter any forms in the world at all, but rather ideas, universals, generalizations are all within the human being and then imposed onto our experience as a way in which the human mind is able to make sense of the world. Rather, what we encounter beyond us, what the world itself actually consists in, or at least what nature itself actually consists in, will be entirely sensory, entirely physical or corporeal. This worldview is then going to raise some very serious problems. If psyche is something that is entirely within the human being and not in the world, then that raises the question of how we can have any kind of universal or general knowledge whatsoever. What can we actually say epistemologically about something like a Newtonian law of motion if such a law of nature is not psyche, but also not something physical which we can actually encounter with our sensory organs? And so this issue is then going to culminate in Humean skepticism, which then will set the stage for the advent of Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism, but that's going to be a story for later on. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a very different way of dealing with this issue that fundamentally, I believe, is the friction between the very Christian need for human moral agency and, ironically, Christian medieval Aristotelianism. And that alternative way of navigating this friction is going to be what we're going to see here in the works of Giordano Bruno. So Bruno did not accept the Aristotelian doctrine of ousia, but nor was he a nominalist. He certainly didn't believe that psyche consisted entirely of generalizations produced by the mind that didn't actually exist in the world independently of us. Instead, Bruno's ontology is going to be rooted in this notion of monads. Now, this notion of the monad is something you might be familiar with. Within Neoplatonic ideology, the monad is essentially considered to be God. The monad takes on this role as the ultimate unmoved mover, the form of all forms, the form of unity itself, which is believed to lie at the heart of all reality. Now, because of that, it might initially seem that Bruno is using this term monad in a very different way than the Neoplatonists, but he didn't see it that way. Bruno's cosmology consisted of an infinite number of monads, but each monad was understood to be an enactment or instantiation of the cosmic monad, the world soul, you could say, or simply God. Each monad is understood to be something that really lacks properties in itself, in a sense. It does not consist of a particular configuration of psyche, nor is it corporeal necessarily. Rather, the monad consists entirely of pure self-determination, in a sense, pure freedom, pure unity. So what this implies is that for Bruno, there actually is something which underlies the psychical and the corporeal within the ontology of the human being. The monad essentially serves almost as a kind of third category of being, which is neither matter nor psyche, and therefore it's something that psyche and materiality can actually adhere within. We as monads actually can steer the ship, as it were, in a way that we're not necessarily determined or compelled or directed by the contents of our psyche in a way that goes beyond our capacity for self-determination. So this essentially amounts to a kind of animism, in which Bruno believed that all things, including material things, including what would appear to be inanimate physical objects and angels and everything else, consisted of these monads. But this puts human beings in a very unique position here, actually. If each monad is an instantiation, a spark, as he says, of the cosmic soul, then most monads, those that adhere within angels or animals or rocks or mountains or what have you, are going to lack a kind of independence. They're all going to be really just instances of the cosmic mind without there being any kind of self-delineation, as it were, such that each monad has its own independent identity. So this would seem to put human beings in a very interesting position. At some deep fundamental level, it may be that we are parts of the cosmic soul or instances of the cosmic soul, but at another level, we have a kind of independent individuality which we feel to be separate from the cosmos, even if we are unified with it. And so this is a topic that Bruno himself is not really going to bear down on in the way that later philosophers will. Philosophers who will develop this much more concrete, much more explicit understanding of subjectivity as such. And here I'm referring primarily to this thread that we see moving through Descartes and then Kant and then Fichte, etc. And that's really going to be one of the main points that we're going to be looking at in the next video. Nonetheless, I believe that Bruno's monadology should be seen as a kind of precursor of these more explicit notions of pure subjectivity, subjectivity as such, or pure self-reflectivity, which are going to become so important later on in this quest for human freedom. Bruno's entire cosmology can be understood as a kind of metaphysics of liberation. In contrast, the Aristotelian worldview is one in which the universe is a kind of closed system of concentric spheres, and the Earth is the lowest, most densified, most fallen layer of that hierarchy. So we here on Earth are in a kind of cosmic prison. We are undergoing a kind of cosmic penance for our fallenness, for the fallenness of Adam, for the affront to God, which is our sinfulness, our materiality. Bruno's cosmology, conversely, is one of infinite creative power. Bruno was a heliocentrist in a time in which that was a bit frowned upon, and moreover, he saw the stars themselves as distant suns. And this was a very radical idea. Bruno believed that every star was a living thing, and that when we looked up at the sky, we were seeing the infinite expanse of God's creative power. So what this implies is that for Bruno, the material world is not fallen in the same way that it is within Aristotelian cosmology. Bruno didn't see the prima materia or cora as this source of moral reprehensibility, this kind of source of all evil and darkness. Rather, Bruno saw the prima materia as this source of infinite creative power. It essentially served as the raw material from which the monads were able to actually participate in the process of cosmic creativity. Giordano Bruno was by no means whatsoever the only pre-modern thinker to come into conflict with the Catholic Church, but it was this: his rejection of original sin, which would cross a line. He would be tried for heresy, turned over to secular authorities, and ultimately burned at the stake in the year 1600. In terms of his legacy, Bruno is often regarded as a kind of martyr for freedom of thought. Sometimes he's even depicted as a kind of martyr for science, though ironically those who depict him in this way tend to gloss over the fact that he was actually a martyr for esoteric science, if anything. The story of Giordano Bruno is often trotted out by scientismic apologetics, at least insofar as his death is able to serve certain ideological narratives, but of course no heed is paid whatsoever to his actual ideas. Bruno's cosmology within the narratives of modern science is regarded as essentially no more than a quirky curiosity of the Renaissance. Ultimately, however, I believe that Giordano Bruno's ideas are actually very important. I see his cosmology as an incomplete, though very well-developed intimation of the possibility of a truly esoteric science. And in the 21st century, I believe that we have all of the tools that we could ever need for actually developing this worldview into a truly rigorous and scientific understanding of nature. Perhaps something akin to what Terence McKenna would have called an ecology of souls. Thanks for watching.